So today I would look in some detail at the fine structure of Hegelian negation and at its metaphysical consequences. As it appears when Hegel introduces it in the second chapter of the Phenomenology, though the ideas he's presenting there correspond to the transition from Sache to Dinge in the science of logic. These are only the first baby steps, soon to be aufgehoben, in his intricate story. But the structure revealed is both interesting in its own right and a cautionary tale for any readers tempted by univocal readings of such central Hegelian formulae as the negation of the negation and identity through difference. I'll be particularly concerned to contrast Hegel's order of explanation with the extensional semantics that defines the modern logistical tradition, which would not really begin for another 60 years and which didn't achieve equivalent expressive power until 160 years after Hegel wrote the passages I'll be discussing. The considerations that drive this narrative of explicitation, transforming what is an sich into what is gesetzt, are, I think, individually all familiar. But the argumentative narrative that they jointly articulate when suitably recruited and deployed is a paradigm of Hegelian conceptual emergence. And it's also a paradigm of analytic metaphysical argument pursued with Hegelian conceptual raw materials, so taking place in a substantially different setting from the Lewisian possible worlds framework within which most such metaphysical argumentation and construction is pursued today. This metaconceptual contrast can be illuminating even in the absence of any antecedent interest in Hegel's ideas. The thought with which the perception chapter begins is that the determinateness of content, even of an immediately given sensory knowing, an act of sensory awareness, as conceived according to the metaconception Hegel calls sense certainty, must be understood in terms of what it excludes or rules out, what's exclusively different from it, not just what is merely, or as he says, indifferently different from it. A meta-difference between two kinds of difference shows up already in the contents of acts of sensory awareness conceived according to the categories of sense certainty. The observable contents expressible in a feature-placing vocabulary that were introduced in sense certainty offer a couple of alternatives. The day of it is day and the raining of it is raining are different. And so are the day of it is day and the night of it is night. But they're different in different senses of different. In the language Hegel uses in the perception chapter, day and raining are merely or compatibly or indifferently, gleichgültig, different. While day and night are exclusively, ausschließend, different. For though different, day and raining are compatible features. It can be both day and raining. While day and night are incompatible. It can't be both day and night. The determinateness of sense contents can't be made intelligible solely in terms of their mere difference. Exclusive difference must also be appealed to. If the contents of minimal sensory knowing stood to one another only in relations of compatible difference, none excluding or ruling out any other, then their occurrence would have no significance, would convey no information. They would be mere events, that's without suches, gears unconnected to any mechanism. Their occurrence is devoid of cognitive significance as any other unrepeatable events. Their differences would be less determinate than, for instance, merely numerical differences. For numbers are exclusively different from one another. And their differences would be less determinate even than those of featureless Euclidean points, even apart from consideration of all the lines, circles, triangles, and so on, whose relations to those points might relate them to one another. For again, being one point precludes being another, whereas merely compatibly different contents can be instantiated together. In fact, contents that are merely or compatibly different are elements of different families of exclusively or incompatibly different contents. Shapes, such as circular, triangular, and rectangular, are exclusively different from one another. Exhibiting one rules out exhibiting any other. And colors also form a family of exclusively different contents, at least as long as we restrict ourselves to monochromatic regions. What can be compatibly different is pairs of contents drawn from different families of incompatibles, red and square, green and triangular, and so on. These merely or compatibly different contents are determinate only insofar as they also stand in relations of incompatibility or exclusions of contents drawn from the same family. It's as such that their occurrence conveys information by excluding the occurrence of other members of the same family of incompatibles. Mere difference is intelligible in the context of such a structure, exhibiting also exclusive differences, but by itself it's too weak to underwrite any notion of determinate content. There are then fundamental conceptual reasons to understand the notion of determinate difference as implicitly involving the meta-distinction between two kinds of difference, exclusive difference and compatible difference. I think Hegel also thinks that this meta-difference is observable, that it's part of the phenomenology of sense experience, not in Hegel's sense of phenomenology, but in a more Husserlian one. That is, I think he thinks the compatibility of day with raining and its incompatibility with night is part of what we're given when we have a sensory experience of the sort that might be expressed in a feature-placing language by "it is day." In grasping that content, part of what we grasp is its place in a space of compatibilities and incompatibilities with other experienceable contents. On this account, Hegel thinks that more is given in sense experience than empiricists such as Locke and Hume do. The experiences we label red and green, and those we label rectangular and triangular, for him are experienced as incompatible, as ruling each other out, while those labeled red and triangular and green and rectangular are experienced as different but compatible. The different possibilities of combination, and so the arraying of features into compatible families of incompatibles, is a ground-level structure of sensory awareness for Hegel, but not for traditional empiricists. They're obliged to treat the fact that one has never experienced a wholly red and wholly green triangle as on a par with the contingent fact that one has never experienced, say, a wholly blue pentagon. Hegel sees the modal difference between the differences between red and triangular and the difference between red and green as something one knows simply by experiencing them. Is this difference of opinion about what's given in sensory experience an empirical disagreement? Can it in principle be settled by introspection? Has traditional empiricism suffered from restricting itself to too narrow a conception of the basic knowledge delivered by sense experience? Hegel's analysis of what's implicit in the idea that basic sensory knowledge has a content that's determinate provides an argument for the claim that knowledge of which experiential features are exclusively different from which, and which merely different, must be part of what one knows in having experiences with those features, which is not to say that the subject need be incorrigible in such matters. One important way in which the enriched empiricism Hegel's considering differs from traditional empiricism, including its 20th century variants, lies in its rejection of the latter's atomism about the contents of immediate sensory experience. If their exclusive differences from one another are an essential part of what's given in experience, then each has the content it does only as a member of and in virtue of the role it plays in a constellation of interrelated contents. An experienced red triangle must locate the experiencing of it in the mere compatible differences of members of two different families of incompatibles, colors and shapes. The result is a kind of holism about what's immediately given in sensory experience. The atomism characteristic of the conception of sensory consciousness understood according to the categories of sense certainty is seen to be incompatible with understanding such consciousness as determinately contentful. Equally important and equally radical is the fact that Hegel's principal metaphysical primitive, determinate negation, is intrinsically and essentially a modal notion. The material incompatibility of red with green and circular with triangular is a matter of what can and cannot be combined, what is and is not possible. modality is built into the metaphysical bedrock of this system. Possibility is conceptually more basic than actuality, in the sense that an immediately given actual experience is intelligible as having the determinate content it does only insofar as it's situated in a space of possibilities, structured by relations of compatible and incompatible difference. The empiricism Hegel is considering, then, is a specifically modally enriched empiricism. And we'll see that, by contrast to Kant, for Hegel, the essentially modal articulation of what's determinate is not restricted to subjective thoughts or experiencings. It also characterizes objective determinate states of affairs, whether possible objects of sensory experience or not. If the contents that can be given in sensory experience, some of which actually are given, contents that might be expressed linguistically in a feature-placing language, are determinate in that they stand to one another in relations of determinate negation, in the sense of modally exclusive difference or material incompatibility, then they also stand to one another in relations of material inferential consequence. In Hegel's idiom, this is to say that although they may be given immediately, the contents of sensory experiences themselves are, as he says, thoroughly mediated. For some feature A, such as it is raining, has another feature B, such as it is precipitating, as a material inferential consequence, just in case everything materially incompatible with B, such as it is fine, is also materially incompatible with A. In this sense, scarlet entails red, and square entails rectangular. In much the same way, even if the features in virtue of which sensory experiences are determinately contentful were construed as unrepeatable, their relations of exclusive difference from one another would ensure that they also fall under repeatables. That is, that they exhibit a kind of universality. For many colors are alike in that they're exclusively different from red, and all shapes are alike in that they're not exclusively different, but merely compatibly different from red. These repeatable commonalities ramify into arbitrary Boolean complexity. For instance, two otherwise dissimilar features might share not being exclusively different from A or B, but being exclusively different from both C and D. More natural sense universals are constructible using entailments defined by exclusions. So all the features that entail red, for instance shades of red such as scarlet and crimson, can be grouped together. And similarly, all the features entailed by rectangular form a kind. As Wilfrid Sellers observes, the primitives appealed to by classical empiricists are determinate sense repeatables. They were concerned with how merely determinable sense repeatables might be understood in terms of these, not with how unrepeatables might give rise to determinate repeatables. It's in virtue of these facts that I take determinate negation to be for Hegel a more metaphysically fundamental concept than mediation or universality. And here you can consult the first chart on your handout. The concept of negation that plays the axial role in the metaphysics Hegel introduces in perception is a rich and complex one. As I've indicated, it's introduced as one element of a dyad. This is the meta-difference between two kinds of difference, mirror or compatible difference and exclusive or incompatible difference. And we've seen that these two kinds of difference articulate determinate repeatable features into compatible families of incompatible features, as in the paradigm of colors and shapes. The next step in understanding exclusive difference is to consider it in relation to another kind of negation. Determinate negation also contrasts with what Hegel calls formal or abstract negation. The latter is logical negation in a more modern non-Hegelian sense of logical. Two features stand in the relation of determinate negation if they're materially incompatible. I'm helping myself here to Sellers' terminology, itself not wholly uninfluenced by Hegel. The idea is that items determinately negate one another in virtue of their non-logical content. Such items stand in the relation of formal or abstract negation if they're logically incompatible in virtue of their abstract logical form. This distinction is as old as logic. It's the distinction between Aristotelian contraries and Aristotelian contradictories. Red and green, circular and triangular are contraries, while red and not red, circular and not circular are contradictories. Both of these are kinds of exclusive difference. So there's a further meta-difference between two species of exclusive difference. The first meta-difference between compatible and incompatible differences is a structure of coordination. Neither sort of difference is definable in terms of the other, and both are required for determinateness. Together, they yield compatible families of incompatible feature kinds. By contrast, contrariety and contradictoriness are interdefinable. There are accordingly two orders of explanation one might pursue in relating them, depending on which one takes as primitive. One can define contraries in terms of contradictories. So, define determinate negation in terms of formal negation. For Q to be a contrary of P is for Q to imply P's contradictory, not P. Green is a contrary of red and triangular of circular, just insofar as green implies not red and triangular implies not circular. Or, contrary-wise, one can define contradictories in terms of contraries. So formal negation in terms of determinate negation. For something to be the contradictory of P, to be not P, is just for it to be the minimal contrary of P, in the sense of being implied by every contrary Q of P. Not red is implied by all of red's contraries, green, blue, yellow, and so on, and not circular is implied by all of circular's contraries, triangular, square, pentagonal, and so on. So the result is the next chart on your handout. Hegel takes determinate negation to be prior in the order of explanation to formal or abstract negation. He accordingly has the second picture in mind, understanding contradictories in terms of contraries. The tradition of extensional logic and semantics, extending from Boole through Russell to Tarski and Quine, adopts the other order of explanation, understanding material incompatibility as contrariety in terms of formal incompatibility as contradictoriness or inconsistency. Each approach has its characteristic advantages. It's worth noting at this point that the interdefinability of contraries and contradictories, hence of determinate and abstract or formal negation, depends on the availability of a notion of implication or consequence. The Hegelian order of explanation has a native candidate. For as I already pointed out, material incompatibility underwrites a notion of entailment. Q is a consequence of P, just in case everything materially incompatible with Q is materially incompatible with P. And what I'll call the Tarskian extensionalist tradition also has available a notion of implication, but it's not directly definable in terms of formal logical negation. It only becomes available if one widens the focus of the Tarskian explanatory strategy. Doing so will illuminate the metaphysical project that Hegel pursues in the perception chapter. In particular, it makes manifest the difference between building modality in at the metaphysical ground floor, as Hegel does, and adding it as a late-coming, perhaps even an optional afterthought, say in Quine's case, as the extensionalist tradition does. The widening of focus I have in mind is to the structure of singular terms and predicates, presenting objects and properties, that Hegel argues is implicit already in the idea of determinate features presented by a feature-placing vocabulary. I'm going to call a conception of the objective world as consisting of particular objects that exhibit repeatable properties, Hegel's universals, as having an Aristotelian structure with a lowercase a. I do so because I take it that it's such a common sense conception, suggested by the way our languages work, that Aristotle aims to explain using his proprietary metaphysical apparatus of individual substances and their essences. I'm after the Aristotelian explanandum rather than the explanans. I take it that it's also the common explanatory target of the perception chapter and of the extensionalist semantic tradition that culminates in Tarskian model theory. But unlike Aristotle himself, neither Hegel in this chapter, though he does in the Logic, nor the extensionalist tradition in general makes anything of the distinction between sortal predicates, expressing kinds such as fox, which come with criteria of identity and individuation, and mere characterizing predicates expressing properties such as red, which do not individuate, which is part of what Aristotle's essentialism is a theory of. There are two broad explanatory strategies available to explicate the Aristotelian structure of objects and properties. Hegel wants to explain it in terms of determinate negation, relating property-like features, the sort that show up in the feature-placing language. I want to eliminate that metaphysical approach by contrasting it with the extensionalist Tarskian tradition, which starts with objects understood as merely different. The two orders of explanation exploiting the relations between contraries and contradictories, hence between determinate and formal abstract negation, are embedded in more encompassing converse explanatory strategies for articulating the Aristotelian object-property categorical structure, rooted in the meta-difference between incompatible and compatible differences. The notion of compatible difference that applies to the objects with which metaphysical extensionalism begins does not appeal to modal notions of possibility or necessity. The mere difference that characterizes elements of the domain of objects of the Tarskian scheme is a primitive material relation, in that it, like the contrariety with which Hegel's converse explanatory strategy begins, is not defined in terms of formal logical concepts. Properties are represented in Tarskian structures as sets of objects, the extensions of the properties. The indiscernibility of identicals, that is, that if objects A and B are identical, they have the same properties, then just follows set theoretically from this definition. The other direction of Leibniz's law, the identity of indiscernibles, will not, unless one insists that every different set of objects determines or constitutes a property. So I'm contrasting the Hegelian order of explanation that starts with exclusive differences among sort of proto-properties, features that will turn into properties, and the Tarskian extensionalist one that starts with objects rather than properties and starts with the mere difference of those objects rather than any kind of exclusiveness. In the extensionalist order of explanation, contradictoriness and so formal negation can be introduced. Contradictory properties are definable as properties with complementary extensions within the domain of objects. Not P, the contradictory of P, is the property whose extension consists of all and only the objects in the domain that are not in the extension of P. The relation of contrariety is not really represented in such extensional structures. What are intuitively contraries, such as square and circular, will have disjoint extensions. But not every pair of disjoint extensions correspond to proper contraries. If the domain doesn't happen to include a mountain made of gold, then being made of gold and being a mountain will be disjoint properties without being genuine contraries. The failure of Tarskian structures to represent contrariety is the result of the modal character of that notion. Contradictoriness of properties is represented because negation is given the same reading in all models. Contradictory properties are those pairs whose extensions exhaustively and exclusively partition the domain of objects. In order to represent the contrariety of properties, we could, in this object-based framework, impose a non-logical material constraint on the Tarskian interpretation function to ensure that the extensions of contrary properties P and Q are disjoint in every model. That's, in effect, what the possible worlds development of Tarskian model theory does. The modal element can be thought of as added by treating contrariety of properties the way logical negation is treated, as a constraint on all interpretations. The account moves up to intensions of properties by looking at functions from indices to extensions. The indices can be models, that is, relational structures, or they can be possible worlds. We've come to see that the differences between these are great. And one important difference is that models have domains of merely different objects, and possible worlds do not. Another is that some logically possible worlds, i.e. combinatorially possible constellations of objects and properties, don't count as really, metaphysically or physically, possible, whereas any relational structure with the right adicities can be a model. This is the point where modality gets incorporated, that is, at the very end of the story. It then trickles down via the intensions of properties to the properties. But it should be emphasized that this constraint is, from the point of view of the underlying raw materials, arbitrary and extraneous. One simply stipulates the disjointment of domains of certain predicates, square and circular, stipulates that that's de jure, while that of others, gold and mountain, is not. Such stipulations come in at the very end of the process of semantic construction, not at the beginning. So possible world semantics in the end also takes the distinction between incompatible and compatible difference, between exclusive and mere difference, for granted. It just builds it in at a different level, as something late coming. A particularly extreme version of the extensionalist order of explanation is that of the Tractatus. Not only does it not build modality into its primitives, it offers only the most attenuated version of modality, constructed at the very end, as something to be understood in terms of logical contradictoriness and so formal negation. The Tractarian scheme starts with mere difference of objects and mere difference of relations among them. Properties are understood as just relations to different objects. All elementary objects can stand in all relations to all other objects. At the ground level, there are no combinatory restrictions at all, except those that follow from the adicity of the relations. What is syntactically, combinatorially, categorially possible, logically possible, is possible tout court. Elementary objects put no constraints on the Sachverhalte that they can enter into, so no restrictions on the properties they can simultaneously exhibit. At this level, properties do not stand to one another in relations of exclusive difference, e.g., where being A's mother implies one cannot be B's father. Indeed, it's a good question whether and how monadic properties can even be merely distinguished in the Tractarian scheme. More complex facts can be incompatible, but this is intelligible only where one truth functionally includes the logical negation of an elementary fact included in the other. Dissatisfaction with this treatment of contrariety of colors seems historically to have played an important role in moving Wittgenstein away from the Tractarian way of thinking about things. Grafting on, at the end, substantive modal constraints on admissible models in the way possible world semantics does not alter the basic Tarskian extensionalist order of explanation. The order of explanation Hegel pursues in the perception chapter is the converse of it. It's of the essence of extensional approaches to appeal only to mere or compatible difference of objects. But besides compatible differences of features, Hegel also acknowledges incompatible or exclusive differences. And we've seen that these come in two Aristotelian species, formal contradictories and material contraries. Hegel focuses on the material, non-logical incompatibility of such contraries. On the basis of this non-logical modal primitive, he then elaborates the full Aristotelian structure of objects with properties, that is, of particulars characterized by universals. There are three distinct moves in the process by which the metaphysical structure of objects with properties is found to be implicit already in what would be expressed by a purely feature-placing vocabulary, once the features deployed in that vocabulary are understood to stand to one another in relations both of compatible and incompatible difference. Each of these three moves involves adding to the picture a further kind of difference, so a further articulation of the complex notion of determinate negation. The first move puts in place the intercategorial difference between properties and objects, or universals and particulars. The second move puts in play an intracategorial difference between two roles that particular objects must play with respect to properties, reflecting the intracategorial difference between merely different and exclusively different properties. The third move registers a fundamental intercategorial metaphysical difference between objects and properties with respect to mere and exclusive differences. The first move in this argument finds the Aristotelian structure of objects and properties, or particulars and universals, to be implicit already in the observation that the features articulating the contents of sense experience stand to one another in relations of material incompatibility or exclusive difference. This argument can be thought of as beginning with the role that what in sense certainty Hegel calls the now plays in the distinction between the two basic kinds of difference, compatible and incompatible. What would be expressed by now one is night is not incompatible with what would be expressed by now two is day. It is incompatible with now one is day. The incompatibility applies only to the same now. We could say that the now is playing the role of a unit of account for incompatibilities. And at this point, we can see that the notion of incompatible difference, of determinate negation, or material incompatibility, which I've been using as three ways of talking about the same thing, that material incompatibility among features implicitly involves a contrast with a different kind of thing, something that is not in the same sense of feature, that is still an essential part of the same structure. For incompatibilities among features require units of account. What's impossible is not that two incompatible features should be exhibited at all. After all, sometimes it's raining and sometimes it's fine. What is impossible is that they should be exhibited by the same unit of account. What we get our first grip on is what would be expressed by a tokening of now, or a here and now, or a this, and the anaphoric repeatability structures that they initiate. So, from the fact that what would be expressed by different nows can exhibit incompatible features, it follows that the structure of sense contents that includes features that can differ either incompatibly or compatibly also essentially includes items that are not features, but that play a different role. These units of account are of a different ontological category from the features for which they are units of account. Besides the intra-categorial difference concerning relations of features between two kinds of difference, incompatible and compatible, of features in sensory experience that would be expressed by sentences in a feature-placing language, sensory experience also implicitly involves the intercategorial difference between features and units of account for incompatibilities of features. And that is to say that what I've called the Aristotelian structure of objects and properties, particulars and universals, is now seen to have been all along implicit in sense experience, even as originally conceived according to the categories of sense certainty. Making this implicit structure explicit yields the form of sensory self-consciousness that Hegel calls perception. And a decisive line has been crossed. The content repeatables exhibited by unrepeatable sense experiencing are no longer to be construed as features, but as properties. What enforces the transition is the association of those sense repeatables not with what's expressed by the indiscriminate it of it is raining, or the undifferentiated, merely existential there is of there is red in a feature-placing language, but with different competing units of account. Looking over the shoulder of the phenomenal self-consciousness that's developing from the categories of sense certainty to those of perception, we see that this differentiation of what exhibits the sense repeatables was implicit already in the different nows acknowledged by sense certainty from the beginning. No longer are the contents of basic sensory knowings construed as what would be expressed in feature-placing vocabularies. Now they're articulated as what requires expression in vocabularies exhibiting the further structures of subjects and predicates. What's experienced is now understood not just as features, but as objects with properties, particulars exhibiting universals. Understanding functional units of account for incompatible sense repeatables, more specifically as objects or particulars, involves further unfolding of what is implicit in distinguishing compatible or merely different sense repeatables from incompatible or exclusively different ones. Hegel says of these features that, quote, these determinantnesses are really only properties by virtue of the addition of a determination yet to come, namely thinghood. He elaborates that notion of thinghood along two dimensions. The thing is exclusive and the thing is inclusive. In talking about these two different roles, essential to being, quote, a thing of many properties, end of the quote, he describes it on the one hand as a one, an excluding unity, and on the other hand as an also, an indifferent unity. The unity of the units of account essentially involves this distinction and the relation between being a one and being an also in his shorthand. These correspond to the roles played by objects with respect to incompatible properties, which they exclude, and their role with respect to compatible properties, which they include. So the intracategorial meta-difference between two kinds of difference between what now show up as properties is reflected by the intracategorial difference between two complementary roles that objects play with respect to those properties as repelling incompatible properties and as a medium unifying a set of compatible properties. As to the first, Hegel says, quote, if the many determinate properties were strictly indifferent, gleichgültig, to one another, if they were simply and solely self-related, they would not be determinate, for they're only determinate insofar as they differentiate themselves from one another and relate themselves to others as their opposites, als entgegengesetzt. This is the by now familiar point that determinateness requires exclusive, incompatible difference, not just mere or indifferent compatible difference. He continues, quote, yet, as thus opposed to one another, they cannot be together in the simple unity of their medium, which is just as essential to them as negation. The differentiation of the properties, insofar as it's exclusive, each property negating the others, thus falls outside of this simple medium. End of that quote. And the medium here is thinghood, the objects that exhibit these properties. He says, quote, the one is the moment of negation. It excludes another, and is that by which thinghood is determined as a thing. End of that quote. So, if A and B are different things, then one can be circular and the other triangular, one red and one green. But one and the same thing cannot have those incompatible properties. A's being circular and red excludes its being triangular or green, and objects are individuated by those exclusions. On the other hand, he says, long quote now, this abstract universal medium, which can be called simply thinghood, is nothing else than what here and now have proved themselves to be, viz., a simple togetherness of a plurality. But the many are, in their determinateness, simple universals themselves. This salt is a simple here, and at the same time manifold. It is white and also tart and also cubical. All these many properties are in a single simple here, in which therefore they interpenetrate. And at the same time, without being separated by different heres, they do not affect each other in this interpenetration. The whiteness does not affect the cubical shape, each leaves the other alone, and is connected with them only by the indifferent also. This also is thus the pure universal itself, or the medium, the thinghood which holds them together in this way. End of the quote. The thing is the medium in which compatible properties can coexist, is the thing as the also. It's the thing of many compatible properties, rather than the thing as excluding incompatible ones. The tokenings of here that sensory consciousness, understanding itself as sense certainty, already saw as expressing a feature of its experiencing, already plays this role as well as the exclusionary one. Already in that primitive case, we can see, quote, the medium in which these determinations penetrate each other, in that universality is a simple unity, but without making contact with each other. For it's precisely through participation in this universality that each is on its own, indifferent to the others. As it's turned out, this abstract universal medium, which can be called thinghood itself, is none other than the here and now, namely a simple ensemble of the many. End of the quote. Along this dimension, too, thinghood, the idea of objects as an essential structural element of the structure that contains properties, shows up first in indexical form of here and nows, and is generalized first by the idea of anaphoric chains recollecting what's expressed by such unrepeatable indexical and demonstrative tokenings on its way to the full-blown logical conception of particulars exhibiting universals. The idea of sense experiencings that are determinately contentful in the sense of being not only distinguishable, but standing in relations of material incompatibility, turns out implicitly to involve a structural categorical contrast between repeatable sense universals and something else. That something else is thinghood or particularity, And then the notion of particularity turns out itself to involve a contrast. Quote, this simple medium is not merely an also, an indifferent unity, it's also a one, an excluding unity. Close quote. These different but complementary roles reflect, within this ontological category, the distinction between compatible and incompatible differences within the opposing ontological category of properties. And here's the next chart on your handout showing properties and universals, compatibly different and incompatibly different, versus objects and particulars. The thing is also, and the thing is excluding one. We've seen that determinateness demands that the identity and individuation of properties acknowledge not only compatible differences between them, but also incompatible differences. Does the identity and individuation of objects also depend on both the role of things as unifying compatible properties and their role as excluding incompatible ones? Hegel says, quote, these diverse aspects are specifically determined. White is white only in opposition to black, and so on. And the thing is a one precisely by being opposed to others. But it is not as a one that it excludes others from itself. It's through its determinateness that the thing excludes others. Things are therefore in and for themselves determinate. They have properties by which they distinguish themselves from others. End of the quote. The first claim here is that the thing as a one is in some sense opposed to other things or excludes them from itself, as he says. Talk of the thing as an excluding one invokes the role of objects as units of account for incompatibilities of properties. But the sense in which objects exclude or are opposed to other objects cannot be the same as the sense in which properties exclude or oppose one another. What would the units of account for those exclusions be? More deeply, we've seen that the material contrariety of properties admits of the definition of opposites in the sense of contradictories. Property Q is the opposite of property P, in this sense, just in case it's exhibited by all and only the objects that do not exhibit P. That's how not red is related to red. An argument due to Aristotle shows that objects don't have opposites in the sense of contradictories. This is from chapter 5 of the Categories. The corresponding notion of an opposite in the ontological category of objects would have object B being the contradictory of object A, just in case B exhibits all and only the properties not exhibited by A. But the properties not exhibited by an object always include properties that are incompatible with one another, and hence not exhibitable by any one object. The red circular object does not exhibit the properties of being green, yellow, triangular, or rectangular, so its opposite would have to exhibit all these properties, as well as all the other colors and shades besides red and circular, and shapes besides red and circular. And that's impossible. The chart on the handout has the property of not being identical to my left little finger and of not being identical to Bach's second Brandenburg Concerto. Its opposite would have to have the property of being identical to both. But since they're not identical to each other, this cannot be. So, although objects both differ from and in some sense exclude one another, there's a huge structural difference between how they do and how properties differ from and exclude one another. The distinction between two kinds of difference that kicks off the whole process of explicitation and elaboration that I've been rehearsing. The Aristotelian argument unfolds what turns out to have been implicit all along in the distinction between the two ontological categories of properties and objects. The key to the difference, the distinction between them, lies in their relation to exclusive difference, the difference between their relations to this kind of difference. How are we to think of objects as being identified and individuated, by contrast to the way properties are? The answer Hegel offers in the passage above is surely right as far as it goes. They're identified and individuated by their properties. This response reinforces the order of explanation being identified as Hegel's, from or properties to objects, reversing the extensionalist Tarskian order of explanation. In virtue of their role as hosting co-compatible properties, objects as alsos merely differ from one another insofar as they host different sets of co-compatible properties. In virtue of their role as excluding properties incompatible with those they host, objects as excluding ones exclude one another insofar as some of the co-compatible properties exhibited by one are incompatible with some of those co-compatible properties exhibited by another. Here we see another aspect of the contrast in order of explanation between the Tarskian extensionalist tradition and Hegel's metaphysics of universals and particulars. The extensionalist tradition offers an answer to the question about how the identity and individuation of objects relates to properties, namely Leibniz's law. It comprises two parts, a weaker and a stronger claim. The first, the indiscernibility of identicals, and the second, the identity of indiscernibles. The first says that identical objects must have all the same properties. The second says that objects with all the same properties are identical. The identity of indiscernibles is stronger than the indiscernibility of identicals, and it seems to depend on there being enough properties. Enough, that is, to distinguish all the objects that are really distinct. As it arises in the extensionalist framework, Leibniz's law appeals only to the mere difference of properties and the mere difference of objects. It becomes controversial how to apply it when modally robust properties are in the picture. How do these principles look in an environment where exclusive difference of properties is also in play, as well as mere difference? The indiscernibility of identicals says that mere difference of properties is sufficient for mere difference of objects. The identity of indiscernibles says that merely different objects have at least merely different properties. I think Hegel endorses these principles. But his talk of objects as excluding one another suggests he also endorses a further, stronger principle. Different objects not only have different properties, they have incompatible properties. We might call this principle the exclusivity of objects. Such a view would satisfy three criteria of adequacy, the first two of which are set by the passage I read a minute ago and quoted above. First, it would underwrite talk of objects as excluding one another. Second, it would do so by appealing to the more primitive notion of properties excluding one another. And third, it would respect the difference between property exclusion and object exclusion that are enforced by the Aristotelian argument, showing that objects cannot have contradictories definable from their exclusions, in the case of properties from their contrarieties, in the way that properties do. In effect, the exclusivity of objects says that it never happens that two objects are distinguished by their roles as things as alsos, combining different compatible properties, according to the discernibility of non-identicals version of our second principle, unless they're also distinguished by their role as things as excluding ones. So let me say that again. The effect of the exclusivity of objects says it never happens that two objects are distinguished by their roles as things as alsos by being merely different in having merely different co-compatible properties without also being different in the sense that they have actually incompatible properties. There's no mere difference of properties distinguishing objects without exclusive difference of properties, that is, having incompatible properties distinguishing them. This is a topic on which Leibniz's law is silent. But the principle of exclusivity of objects does hold even within the extensionalist context, at least provided logical vocabulary is available. For even there, it's denied that two objects could differ, merely differ, just by having different, merely or compatibly different properties. Taking our cue from the appeal to identity properties used to illustrate the Aristotelian argument that objects cannot have contradictories, we can notice that if A and B are indeed not identical, then A will have the property of being identical to A, and B will have the property of being identical to B. And if A and B are not identical, then nothing can have both properties. That is, those identity properties are not merely different properties, they're exclusively different. It's impossible for any object that has the one property to have the other. So, thinking about things from the extensionalist direction, beginning with mere differences of objects and identifying merely different properties, in effect with sets of them, does yield a version of the principle of the exclusivity of objects. If object A is red and object B differs from it by not having that property, then appeal to the notion of formal or abstract negation yields the result that B has the property that's the contradictory of red. It has the property of being not red. And that property is exclusively different from red, in that it's a property of formal negation, that it's logically impossible for any object to have both properties simultaneously. So, provided that logical vocabulary such as identity and formal negation is available to define complex properties, merely different objects will be exclusively different in the extensionalist order of explanation. The fact that the principle of the exclusivity of objects, that merely different objects will have not only compatibly different properties, but also incompatibly different ones, arises early in the Hegelian order of explanation and late in the extensionalist one. And that's a consequence of and a reflection of the two different orders of explanation regarding the relations between material contrariety and formal contradictoriness that they adopt. For distinguishing at the outset compatibly from incompatibly different properties, as Hegel does, commits one to a picture of properties as coming in compatible families of incompatible properties, as in the paradigmatic case of shapes and colors of monochromatic Euclidean plane figures. If objects A and B differ merely in compatible properties, they differ in properties drawn from different families of incompatibles. For example, A is red and B is square. But for them to be distinguished from each other thereby, A must not also be square and B must not also be red. But if A is not square, it will exhibit some other shape, incompatible with being square. And if B is not red, it will exhibit some other color, incompatible with being red. But then A and B will have properties that are not merely different from one another, but incompatible with one another. That's just what the exclusivity of objects claims. According to this picture, kinds of things are characterized by which compatible families of incompatible properties they must exhibit. Sounds can be shapeless and colorless, but they must have some pitch and volume. But any monochromatic Euclidean plane figure must have both a shape and a color, on pain of not qualifying as a determinate particular of that kind. In a sense, then, for the identity and individuation of objects, the exclusiveness of objects, which appeals to exclusive differences of properties, is more basic in the Hegelian order of explanation than Leibniz's law, which appeals to mere difference of properties. This observation completes the rehearsal of the argument that elaborates what's implicit in the idea of the contents of sensory consciousness as what would be expressed in a feature-placing vocabulary, through the consideration of what's implicit in the requirement that the features articulating those contents must be determinate, through the consideration of the relation of negation and universality to the much more finely structured idea of those contents as presenting a world consisting of empirical objects with many observable properties. We're now in a position to understand what Hegel's after, when in the opening introductory paragraphs of the perception chapter, he says such things as, this is a jumble of quotes all from the very opening paragraphs, perception takes what's present to it as universal. As it has turned out, it's merely the character of positive universality which is at first observed and developed. Only perception contains negation. Being is a universal in virtue of having its mediation, or the negative, within it. When it expresses this in its immediacy, it is a differentiated determinate property. Since the principle of the object, the universal, is in its simplicity a mediated universal, the object must express this, its nature, in its own self. And this it does by showing itself to be the thing with many properties. The passage I want to focus on at this point is one in which Hegel summarizes what we'll learn by talking about, quote, sensuous universality, that is, the immediate unity of being and the negative, end of quote. For here he's announcing that in this chapter we get our introduction to one of his master ideas, that determinateness should be understood as a kind of identity constituted by difference, a unity articulated through disparity. Though he has other big ideas, this is the central structural innovation of his thought about what he calls logic, which only later in the story is differentiated into a semantics addressing the structure of the subjective realm of thought and an ontology or metaphysics addressing the structure of the objective realm of being. One of my main interpretive claims is that determinate negation or material incompatibility on the side of thinking subjects is deontic incompatibility, a matter of commitment and entitlement. And then on the side of objects thought about is alethic incompatibility, a matter of necessity and possibility. And that Hegel's idealism is a story about the unity constituted by these different kinds of difference. But that's a story for another occasion. Actually, in my fourth lecture. What we've been exploring is the metaphysical fine structure of what Hegel invokes in the passage I just cited as the negative. One of Hegel's own summaries is this, quote, "The thing as the truth of perception reaches its culmination to the extent that it's necessary to develop that here. It is alpha, the indifferent passive universality, the also of the many properties. Beta, the negation, generally as simple, that is, the one, the excluding of contrasting properties. And gamma, the many properties themselves, the relation of the first two moments. The negation as it relates itself to the indifferent element and extends itself within it as a range of differences, the point of individuality in the medium of enduring existence, radiating out into multiplicity." End of the quote. In fact, I've argued that Hegel's metaphysical analysis of the fine structure of the Aristotelian object with many properties and his derivation of it from the concept of determinate universality is substantially more intricate than that summary of his indicates. As on offer in the perception chapter, it's a constellation of no fewer than 10 interrelated kinds of difference. We began by distinguishing mere or indifferent, gleichgültig difference of compatible universals from exclusive difference of incompatible universals. And that brought into view, third, the meta-difference between mere and exclusive difference. This is the first intracategorial meta-difference between differences relating universals to universals. It is itself a kind of exclusive difference, since the universals must be either compatible or incompatible. Within exclusive difference, there are two species that can be related by two opposing orders of explanation: material contrariety, corresponding to determinate negation, and formal contradictoriness, corresponding to abstract logical negation. And there is also then, our sixth one, the meta-difference between determinate and abstract logical negation. This is the second intracategorial meta-difference between differences relating universals to universals. These are not exclusively, but only compatibly different. Contradictories are a kind of contrary, namely minimal contraries. Implicit in the concept of repeatables as universals is, seventh difference, the difference between universals and particulars. That's the first intercategorial difference. And it too is a kind of exclusive difference. Implicit in the concept of particulars in relation to universals is 8, the difference between the two roles that particulars can play. Particulars as alsos, that is, as medium hosting a community of compatible universals, and particulars as exclusive ones, that is, as units of account repelling incompatible properties. This is the first intracategorial difference between roles played by particulars. These are what we might call strongly compatibly different roles, since every particular not only can, but must play both of them. And corresponding to this difference on the side of particulars is the ninth difference between two roles that universals play with respect to particulars. Universals as related to an inclusive one in community with other compatible universals, and universals as excluding incompatible universals associated with different exclusive ones. And finally, the 10th difference is between universals and particulars that consists in the fact that universals do and particulars do not have contradictories or opposites. Unless the distinctions and intricate interrelations between these different ways in which things can be said to differ from or negate others are kept firmly in mind, nothing but confusion can result in thinking about Hegel's metaphysics of negation. As an illustration, both determinate properties and objects can be understood as, to use a favorite Hegelian phrase, negations of the negation, but in very different ways. Accordingly, as both what is negated and the negating of it must have senses drawn from the different elements of the list that I just rehearsed. For instance, the first negating of a negation is intracategorial among universals, and the second is intercategorial, distinguishing particulars from universals. And in the first case, the identity of a determinate property consists in how it negates or differs from all of its material contraries. Each is, in sense two, the negation of the property in question. And it's by being the contrary of, negating all of its exclusive contraries, that it is the determinate property it is. This is one sense in which universals as such contain negation within themselves, which is why perception, quote, takes what is present to it as universal and thereby contains negation. In the second case, according to the order of explanation I've attributed to Hegel, particulars are understood in terms of their exclusive difference of types 7 and 9 from universals. Since the universals are the determinate universals they are because of their negations of one another, particulars can be understood as negations of the negations that articulate those universals. They are of the category that does not negate others of its category in the way universals do negate others of their category. These are two examples of two kinds of identity that are intelligible as constituted by negating a negation, but are obviously quite different due to the different kinds of negation. So we've seen Hegel argue that the idea that sense experience has a determinate content implicitly involves the idea that such contents can differ from one another in two different ways. And we've seen how he argues that the Aristotelian structure of objects with properties is implicit in the relations between these two sorts of differences, these two senses in which contents can negate one another. The result is a case study concerning how Hegel thinks a more complex structure can be implicit in a simpler one in terms of the process by which one goes about making it explicit.